the Ides of March in the year 44 BC, a date that would echo through the millennia, marked with fire and blood in the annals of history. In the very heart of Rome, in Pompey's Curia, adjacent to the theater where the people cheered their heroes, the man who had subjugated Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon in defiance of the Senate, who had defeated Pompey at Pharsalus, and had proclaimed himself dictator perpetuus of the Roman Republic, now lay in a pool of his own blood, his purple toga torn and stained an even deeper red by the 23 stab wounds that had ended his life. Gaius Julius Caesar, the undefeated general, the astute politician, the brilliant orator, the lover of Cleopatra, the man who aspired to divinity, or perhaps already believed himself to be a god, has fallen victim to a conspiracy hatched in the shadows by those who claimed to defend the freedom of the Republic, but who perhaps only defended their own threatened privileges. Among the assassins were faces that were once familiar to him, friends who shared his table, and even, according to the legend immortalized by Shakespeare, his own adopted son, Marcus Junius Brutus, to whom Caesar, in a final heart-rending whisper, is said to have uttered those immortal words, "You too, my son? Tu quoque brute fili me?" The death of Julius Caesar was not just the murder of a man, however great he may have been. It was the assassination that brought an end to the Roman Republic and opened the doors to a new era of civil wars, and ultimately to the establishment of the empire under his grandnephew and heir, Octavian, the future Augustus. Was Caesar an ambitious tyrant who deserved his fate for destroying republican freedoms? Or was he a misunderstood visionary, a necessary reformer trying to lead Rome out of chaos and corruption, who was betrayed by the envy and fear of a decadent senatorial oligarchy? This is the chronicle of a bloody conspiracy, the story of the last days of a colossus who believed himself invulnerable, and the enigma that still surrounds the true motivations of his assassins and the far-reaching consequences of his death. Join me in unraveling the threads of this deadly plot, exploring the psychology of Caesar and his conspirators, and witnessing the day when Rome was stained with blood and the world changed forever. Was Caesar's assassination an act of liberation, or the beginning of a new tyranny? The question, like the 23 stab wounds in his body, remains open and bleeding in the conscience of the West. To understand the full magnitude and tragic implications of the assassination of Gaius Julius Caesar, and to understand the complex and often contradictory forces that led a group of Roman senators, many of them former friends and beneficiaries of Caesar himself, to plunge their daggers into the body of the most powerful man in Rome, it is absolutely essential that we first immerse ourselves, with due attention to historical detail and the turbulent political and social context, into the Roman Republic of the mid-1st century BCE. We find ourselves in a period of profound and rapid transformation, of recurring crises and endemic political violence that threatened to destroy the very foundations of a state that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. The Roman Republic, founded on the ideals of civic liberty, senatorial government, and respect for the law, the mos maiorum, was in its death throes, devoured from within by the unbridled ambition of its most powerful generals, by the widespread corruption of its political class, by growing social inequalities between a minority of patricians and equites, enriched by conquests and a mass of impoverished and discontented plebeians, and by the inability of its ancient republican institutions to govern an increasingly vast, complex, and heterogeneous empire. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in Rome on July 12 or 13, 100 BC, the exact date is a matter of debate among historians, into one of Rome's oldest and proudest patrician families, the gens Julia, which boasted of being directly descended from Julius, the son of the Trojan hero Aeneas, and therefore of the goddess Venus herself. Despite his illustrious lineage, Caesar's family did not belong at that time to the most influential circle of the senatorial oligarchy, and his youth was marked by bloody civil strife between the populares, led by his political uncle Gaius Marius, and the Optimates, headed by the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla. These early experiences of political violence and proscriptions, Caesar himself was nearly a victim of Sulla's purges, forged in him an ambitious, bold, pragmatic character with an extraordinary capacity for survival and adaptation. He received a careful education, as befitted a young man of his rank, which included the study of rhetoric, where he excelled as a brilliant and persuasive speaker, Greek and Latin literature, philosophy, and military art. His intelligence was sharp and penetrating, his culture vast, and his personal charisma irresistible. He possessed boundless energy, a prodigious memory, and an astonishing capacity for work. Physically, although not particularly large, he was athletic, resilient, and naturally elegant. His legendary premature baldness, which he tried to conceal with a laurel wreath, would become one of his distinguishing features. Caesar's rise to power was gradual but unstoppable, a masterpiece of political skill, military audacity, and boundless ambition. He began his public career, the cursus honorum, in various minor positions, such as military tribune, quaestor in Hispania, and curule aedile in Rome, where he won the favor of the plebs by organizing grandiose and costly spectacles. In 60 BC, he formed the so-called First Triumvirate, an informal but extraordinarily powerful political alliance with two other strong men of the Republic, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the most prestigious and popular general in Rome at the time, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in the city. Thanks to this alliance, Caesar was elected consul in 59 BC, and the following year obtained the proconsulship of Gaul, an extraordinary military command that would allow him, for almost a decade, from 58 to 50 BC, to carry out one of the most brilliant and brutal campaigns of conquest in ancient history, the Gallic Wars. In those 8 years, Caesar not only completely subjugated the numerous and warlike Gallic tribes from the Alps to the Rhine and the Atlantic, annexing a vast and rich territory to the Roman Empire, but also forged a formidable army, experienced and absolutely loyal to him, and amassed an immense personal fortune and unprecedented military prestige. His Commentaries on the Gallic War, written in elegant, concise, and seemingly objective prose, but in reality a masterpiece of political propaganda, made him a popular hero in Rome and a figure feared and envied by his rivals in the Senate. However, his military successes and growing power also aroused deep mistrust and hostility among the conservative senatorial oligarchy, the so-called optimates, who saw Caesar as a mortal threat to the republican institutions and their own privileges. Figures such as Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger, an unyielding stoic and staunch defender of the ancient republican virtues, and Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator and philosopher, although more ambivalent towards Caesar, led the senatorial opposition against him. The First Triumvirate had disintegrated with the death of Crassus in Parthia, 53 BC, and the gradual estrangement between Caesar and Pompey, who, jealous of the power and popularity of his former ally, had moved closer and closer to the senatorial camp. The tension between Caesar, who was in Gaul at the head of his legions, and the Senate, dominated by his enemies, reached a critical point at the end of 50 BC, when the Senate ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to be tried for alleged irregularities committed during his proconsulship. Caesar, aware that if he obeyed, he would be destroyed politically and perhaps even physically, made a bold and momentous decision that would forever change the course of Roman history. On the night of January 10th, 1149 BC, at the head of one of his legions, the Legio Thorietine Gemina, he crossed the Rubicon, a small stream that marked the sacred boundary between the province of Cisalpine Gaul and the territory of Italy proper. As he crossed the Rubicon with his army in arms, an act that Roman law considered a declaration of war and sacrilege, Caesar uttered, according to Suetonius, the famous phrase, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. Thus began a new and devastating civil war that would pit Caesar and his supporters, the populares, against Pompey and the majority of the Senate, the optimates. The war was short but bloody. Caesar, with his military genius and the unconditional loyalty of his veteran legions, defeated Pompey and his allies in a series of decisive battles, such as those of Ilerda in Hispania, Pharsalia in Greece, 48 BC, Thapsus in Africa, 46 BC, and Munda in Hispania, 45 BC. Pompey was assassinated in Egypt after his defeat at Pharsalus. Cato the Younger committed suicide in Utica to avoid falling into Caesar's hands. And the last pockets of republican resistance were mercilessly crushed. After his total victory in the Civil War, Caesar returned to Rome in 45 BC as the absolute and undisputed ruler. He accumulated a series of unprecedented positions and honors. He was named dictator for life, dictator perpetuus, consul for 10 years, prefect of customs, prefectus morum, pontiff, pontifex maximus, and received the title Father of the Fatherland, Pater Patriae. Although formally the Republic continued to exist, with its magistrates and senate, in practice all power was concentrated in the hands of Caesar, who ruled as a de facto absolute monarch, although he always took care not to accept the title of king, rex, a title deeply hated by the Romans since the expulsion of the Tarquinii 5 centuries earlier. During his brief but intense period of absolute rule, 49-44 BC, Caesar undertook an ambitious program of political, social, and economic reforms aimed at reorganizing the Roman state, alleviating the situation of the most disadvantaged classes, and ensuring the stability of the empire. He reformed the calendar, introducing the Julian calendar, which, with some modifications, is still the basis of our calendar, distributed land among his veterans and the proletarians of Rome, undertook vast public works programs, reorganized the administration of the provinces, granted Roman citizenship to many inhabitants of the provinces, and planned new and grandiose military campaigns, such as an expedition against the Parthians to avenge the defeat of Crassus. However, his increasingly autocratic power, his apparent disregard for republican traditions and the authority of the Senate, and persistent rumors that he aspired to be crowned king and establish a hereditary monarchy of the Hellenistic type, possibly under the influence of his Egyptian lover, Queen Cleopatra, with whom he had a son, Caesarion, generated deep resentment and growing alarm among a sector of the senatorial aristocracy. Many senators, even some who had been pardoned and favored by Caesar after the Civil War, began to see him not as a savior of the Republic, but as a tyrant who had destroyed Roman liberties and threatened to perpetuate himself in power indefinitely. The omens of a new conspiracy, this time directed against Caesar's own life, began to accumulate in the tense atmosphere of Rome. There was talk of premonitory dreams, of ominous omens, of warnings that had been ignored. An aruspice named Spurina had warned him to beware of the Ides of March. His own wife, Calpurnia, had a nightmare the night before his death in which she saw Caesar murdered in her arms. But Caesar, whether out of fatalism, arrogance, or an excess of confidence in his own invulnerability, ignored all these warnings. An enigma hung over his figure. Was he aware of the real danger he was in, or had he become blind to the conspiracies being woven around him? And a symbolic object, the dagger, the traditional weapon of tyrannicides in Roman history, began to be sharpened in the shadows, ready to deliver its deadly blow. The uncertain crown of perpetual dictatorship, which Caesar had so boldly placed upon his head, would soon become a crown of thorns. The downward spiral that, in a relatively short period of time, but with unusual dramatic intensity, would take Gaius Julius Caesar from the pinnacle of absolute power in Rome, from his apparent invulnerability as perpetual dictator and father of the fatherland, to his brutal and bloody assassination at the foot of the statue of his former rival Pompey, was a complex and multifactorial process. It was fueled by an explosive combination of factors: the growing and barely concealed resentment of a significant part of the senatorial aristocracy, which saw in Caesar's autocratic power the definitive destruction of the ancient republican liberties and a direct threat to its own privileges and traditional political influence. The fear, real or exaggerated, that Caesar aspired to crown himself king of Rome and establish a hereditary monarchy of the Hellenistic type, a concept deeply abhorred by Roman tradition. Personal ambitions and rivalries among Caesar's own followers, some of whom felt neglected or insufficiently rewarded, and perhaps also certain miscalculations, certain gestures of arrogance or contempt for republican forms on Caesar's part, which contributed to alienating some of his former supporters and emboldening his enemies. As Caesar consolidated his power after his final victory in the Civil War, and as he accumulated an unprecedented number of offices, honors, and titles, dictator for life, consul for multiple years, imperator, a military title implying supreme command, pontifex maximus, etc., the senatorial opposition, though silenced and apparently subdued, began to reorganize in the shadows, weaving a web of conspiracies and seeking ways to rid themselves of the man who, in their eyes, had become a tyrant. The leaders of this conspiracy, which eventually brought together more than 60 senators, were two men of very different profiles, but united by the same hatred or fear of Caesar: Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Marcus Junius Brutus was a young senator of noble lineage, descended, according to tradition, from Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder of the Roman Republic who had expelled the last king, Tarquinius Superbus. Brutus, a man of deep republican and stoic convictions, had fought on Pompey's side during the Civil War, but had been generously pardoned by Caesar after the Battle of Pharsalus and even promoted to important positions, such as urban praetor. However, despite Caesar's favor, who, according to some rumors, felt an almost paternal affection for him, as his mother, Servilia, had been one of Caesar's most notorious mistresses, Brutus felt increasingly uncomfortable with the dictator's absolute power and the apparent disappearance of republican freedoms. He struggled for a long time between his personal loyalty to Caesar and his republican principles, but finally, influenced by Cassius and other conspirators, he became convinced that tyrannicide was not only a right, but a sacred duty to save the republic. Gaius Cassius Longinus, for his part, was an experienced military man and an ambitious and resentful politician who had also fought on Pompey's side and had been pardoned by Caesar. Unlike Brutus, whose motivations seemed to be more idealistic, Cassius's were probably more personal and pragmatic. He envied Caesar's power, felt neglected in the distribution of offices and honors, and feared that the consolidation of perpetual dictatorship would mean the end of his own political ambitions. Cassius was, according to most sources, the real mastermind and main instigator of the conspiracy, the one who knew how to bring together the discontented and convince the reluctant Brutus to join the cause. The conspirators' plan was to assassinate Caesar during a Senate session, a symbolic place that represented the authority and republican legitimacy they sought to restore. The date chosen was the Ides of March, March 15th, of the year 44 BC, a day when Caesar was due to attend the Senate to discuss, among other matters, the granting of new honors and powers, and to officially announce the preparations for his imminent and grandiose military campaign against the Parthians, a campaign that would take him away from Rome for several years, and which, in the eyes of the conspirators, could further consolidate his power and facilitate his coronation as king. In the weeks and days leading up to the Ides of March, the tension in Rome was palpable. All kinds of rumors, ominous omens, and warnings about a possible attempt on Caesar's life were circulating. There was talk of premonitory dreams of his wife Calpurnia, of unfavorable sacrifices, of enigmatic words from haruspices and soothsayers. Caesar himself, although he publicly displayed unshakable confidence in his own fortune and in the loyalty of his followers, could not completely ignore these signs of danger. According to some accounts, he even considered not attending the Senate session on the Ides of March, pressured by Calpurnia's pleas and his own fears. However, the intervention of one of the conspirators, Decimus Junius Brutus Albino, a distant relative of Marcus Brutus and one of Caesar's most trusted men, which makes his betrayal even more tragic, who urged him not to show fear or superstition and not to disappoint the expectations of the Senate, finally convinced him to attend the fateful meeting. The downward spiral accelerated. The conspirators, increasingly nervous and determined, finalized the details of their plan. They had managed to smuggle daggers hidden under their togas into Pompey's Curia, the place where the Senate session was to be held, since the Curia Hostilia, the traditional Senate building in the Forum, had been destroyed in a fire and was being rebuilt by order of Caesar. Roles had been assigned, possible contingencies had been planned, and an oath of secrecy had been sworn on pain of death. The atmosphere in Rome was one of feverish anticipation, a tense calm before the storm. An internal hook in this escalation of tension could be a detailed description of some of the warnings Caesar received and ignored, or the introduction of one of the secondary conspirators and their particular motivations. For example, Gaius Trebonius, another of Caesar's lieutenants who joined the conspiracy and was assigned the task of entertaining Mark Antony outside the Curia while the assassination was being carried out, to prevent him, a man of great physical strength and loyalty to Caesar, from intervening in his defense. Caesar's desperation, paranoia, or denial of the conspiracy being woven behind his back are the subject of debate. Was he really so naive as to fail to perceive the hatred and resentment that his absolute power generated among the senatorial aristocracy? Or did he blindly trust his own star, his fortune, and the supposed loyalty of those he had pardoned and showered with honors? Perhaps it was a mixture of all of these, combined with a certain arrogance and stoic fatalism that led him to accept his fate, whatever it might be. What is certain is that, on those Ides of March, Caesar walked toward Pompey's Curia like a lamb to the slaughter, ignoring or disregarding the many signs that heralded his tragic and imminent end. The shadow of the executioner, or rather that of a large and heterogeneous group of volunteer executioners, Roman senators armed with daggers hidden under their togas, loomed ever more tangibly, oppressively, and inescapably over the figure of Gaius Julius Caesar in those first fateful days of March 44 BC. His decline, if one can speak of decline in a man who until the very end retained an astonishing energy and capacity for work, was not so much physical as political and moral in the eyes of his enemies. His absolute power, his accumulation of almost divine honors, his apparent contempt for ancient republican traditions, and above all, the growing fear that he aspired to be crowned king and establish a hereditary monarchy, had seriously eroded his popularity among the senatorial class and lit the fuse of a conspiracy that could no longer be stopped. The atmosphere in Rome on the eve of the Ides of March was almost unbearably tense, a mixture of feverish anticipation, alarming rumors, and a widespread sense that something terrible and irrevocable was about to happen. The descriptions left to us by ancient historians of Caesar's state of mind in those last days are contradictory and often colored by legend or the intentions of the authors. Some portray him as an increasingly isolated, gloomy, distrustful man, tormented by bad omens and the fear of betrayal. It is said that he suffered from insomnia, had recurring nightmares, and was irritable and taciturn. His wife, Calpurnia, deeply affected by a premonitory dream in which she saw Caesar murdered in her arms and the pediment of their house collapsing, begged him with tears in her eyes not to attend the Senate session scheduled for the Ides of March. Others, however, describe him as a calm, fatalistic man, almost indifferent to danger, who disregarded warnings and trusted blindly in his own luck and the loyalty of his followers. "It is better to die once than to live in constant fear of death," he is reported to have said, according to Plutarch. The truth is that Caesar, despite the many warnings he received, from the prophecies of the soothsayer Spurinia, who had predicted great danger for the Ides of March, to the anonymous notes handed to him in the street, which he often did not even read, finally decided to attend the fateful Senate session. Perhaps it was so as not to appear cowardly or superstitious, perhaps out of an excess of confidence in his own invulnerability, or perhaps, as some have suggested, because deep down he was tired of living under the constant threat of conspiracy and preferred to face his fate once and for all. The reactions of the court, or what remained of it that was not involved in the conspiracy, his family, and the people of Rome at the prospect of an attack on Caesar, were one of enormous anticipation and contained fear. Many of his most loyal friends and supporters, such as Mark Antony, his deputy and fellow consul, or Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, his cavalry commander, tried to dissuade him from going to the Senate or offered to reinforce his personal guard. But Caesar rejected these precautions, stating that he did not want to live like a tyrant, surrounded by guards and fearing his own citizens. The people of Rome, in general, felt a mixture of admiration for Caesar's military victories and popular reforms, and a certain reverential fear of his absolute power. There does not seem to have been a popular outcry in favor of his assassination, nor a passionate defense of his person against the senatorial intrigues. Most probably viewed the events with a mixture of curiosity, indifference, and vague apprehension about the possible consequences of an assassination. Desperate attempts to save Caesar, or at least warn him of the imminent danger, continued until the last moment, but all were in vain. It is said that a Greek master of rhetoric named Artemidorus of Cnidus, who knew the details of the conspiracy, tried to give Caesar a note warning him of the danger as he was on his way to Pompey's Curia, but Caesar, surrounded by the crowd and distracted by other matters, did not read it. The clock of his death was ticking mercilessly. The conspiracy, which had been hatched in great secrecy and meticulous detail for weeks, was about to reach its bloody climax. The conspirators, more than 60 senators, including men who owed Caesar their careers, their fortunes, and even their lives, had gathered in Pompey's Curia, armed with daggers hidden under their togas, awaiting the arrival of their victim. The tension between them must have been unbearable. Any mistake, any hesitation, any last-minute leak could have ruined the plan and brought them certain and terrible death. But hatred, fear, and Republican idealism were stronger than any fear. They were determined to kill the tyrant and liberate Rome, even if they had to pay for it with their own lives. The shadow of the executioner, multiplied 60-fold, was already cast, cold and sharp, over the figure of the perpetual dictator. On the morning of the Ides of March, the 15th day of that month in the year 44 before the Common Era, dawn broke in Rome charged with palpable tension, dark omens, and a feverish anticipation that could be felt in every corner of the city. Gaius Julius Caesar, the man who had subjugated Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon in defiance of the Senate's authority, who had defeated his rivals in a bloody civil war, and who had set himself up as perpetual dictator of the Roman Republic, was preparing to attend a Senate session which, unbeknownst to him, would be the last of his life. Despite the pleas of his wife Calpurnia, who, tormented by a premonitory dream in which she saw him murdered, had begged him not to go to the Curia, and despite the many warnings and ominous signs he had received in the previous days, unfavorable sacrifices, enigmatic words from soothsayers, and even the famous warning from the Haruspex Spurina, who had warned him to beware of the Ides of March, Caesar, whether out of overconfidence in his own star, fatalistic disregard for omens, or simply not wanting to appear fearful or superstitious before his enemies, finally decided to go to his appointment with destiny. It is said that upon leaving his house, he met Spurina and said to him mockingly, "The Ides of March have already arrived." To which the soothsayer replied with grim serenity, "Yes, Caesar, they have arrived, but they have not yet passed." Upon arriving at Pompey's Curia, a building adjacent to the great theater built by his former rival, where the Senate session was being held, since the traditional Curia in the Forum was being rebuilt, Caesar was greeted with the usual honors, but also with an atmosphere of concealed tension. One of the conspirators, Gaius Trebonius, fulfilling his assigned role in the plan, took it upon himself to entertain Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and his consular colleague, outside the building on the pretext of discussing some urgent matter, thus preventing this man of great physical strength and proven loyalty from intervening in defense of the dictator once the attack began. Caesar entered the Curia and sat down in his golden chair, located at the foot of a large statue of Pompey the Great, a cruel irony of fate that would not go unnoticed by later historians. The conspiring senators, who had strategically distributed themselves throughout the room, began to surround him, pretending to present him with various requests or ask him for favors. The first to approach was Lucius Tillius Cimbrus, who, under the pretext of begging forgiveness for his exiled brother, grabbed Caesar's toga by the shoulders, as if to kneel before him, but in reality to prevent him from moving and to give the agreed signal to the other conspirators. It was then that Publius Servilius Casca, one of the Casca brothers involved in the plot, drew his dagger and stabbed Caesar, wounding him in the neck or shoulder. Caesar, surprised and in pain, turned around and, according to Suetonius, exclaimed in Greek, "Wicked Casca, what are you doing?" while trying to defend himself with his stylus, a writing tool. But it was too late. The signal had been given, and the rest of the conspirators, like a pack of hungry wolves, pounced on him, each eager to plunge his own dagger into the body of the tyrant. What followed was a scene of indescribable violence and cruelty. More than 60 senators, armed with daggers they had hidden under their togas, surrounded Caesar and began stabbing him repeatedly in an orgy of blood and hatred. At first, Caesar tried to defend himself, fighting with the strength of desperation, covering his face with his toga so as not to show his agony and to die with some dignity. But there were too many of them, and the attack was too fierce. He was wounded all over, in the chest, in the back, in the arms, in the legs. Blood gushed out, staining his purple toga, the marble floor of the Curia, and the bloody hands of his murderers. It was in the midst of this bloody turmoil that, according to the most widespread and dramatic tradition, immortalized by Shakespeare, but already present in some ancient authors such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Caesar saw among his attackers the face of Marcus Junius Brutus, the man he had pardoned after the Civil War, whom he had showered with honors, and whom, according to some, he loved like a son. Upon recognizing him, Caesar, with a last breath of surprise, pain, and bitter disappointment, is said to have uttered those immortal words, either in Latin, tu quoque, fili me, or in Greek, kaisu, teknon, you too, my son? After this last heart-rending cry, Caesar ceased to resist, covered his face completely with his toga, and collapsed lifeless at the feet of the statue of his former enemy, Pompey the Great, as if fate had willed that the victor of Pharsalus should meet his end under the stony gaze of the vanquished. The body of Gaius Julius Caesar, the man who had conquered an empire and changed the course of history forever, now lay lifeless, pierced by 23 stab wounds, in a pool of his own blood, in the very place where he had so often exercised his absolute power. The exact moment of his death, amid the chaos and murderous fury, is impossible to determine, but his agony, though probably brief, must have been excruciating. The atmosphere immediately after the assassination was one of deathly silence and astonishment, followed by an explosion of screams, confusion, and panic. The senators who had not participated in the conspiracy, horrified by the scene, fled in terror from the Curia. The assassins themselves, their hands and daggers still bloody, took to the streets proclaiming that they had killed the tyrant and restored freedom to the Republic. But they found a city in a state of shock and fear, and not the popular enthusiasm they had perhaps expected. Mark Antony, upon learning of what had happened, took refuge in his home, fearing for his own life. Caesar's body was left abandoned for several hours on the floor of the Curia, until finally 3 of his slaves picked it up and carried it on a litter to his home. The revelation, or rather the consummation of the tyrannicide, far from bringing the peace and freedom longed for by the conspirators, would open the doors to a new and even bloodier period of civil wars, which would put an end to the Roman Republic and pave the way for the establishment of the empire under the leadership of Octavian, Caesar's young and unexpected heir. The climax of Julius Caesar's death was not only the end of a man, but the beginning of the end of a world. The official announcement of the death of Gaius Julius Caesar, although news of his brutal assassination in Pompey's Curia spread like wildfire through the streets of Rome in a matter of hours, plunging the city into a state of shock, confusion, and paralyzing fear, did not come immediately or in an orderly manner. The conspirators themselves, after carrying out the assassination, left the Curia with their bloody daggers raised high, shouting that they had killed the tyrant and that the freedom of the Republic had been restored. They hoped, perhaps naively, to be hailed as heroes and liberators by the people and the Senate. However, the initial reaction of most of the senators who were not involved in the plot was panic and flight. And the people of Rome, although they may not have felt passionate love for Caesar, did not look kindly on those who had murdered him in such a brutal and treacherous manner, and rightly feared that the assassination would trigger a new wave of violence and civil war. In the hours following the assassination, Rome was a hotbed of rumors, uncertainty, and political maneuvering behind the scenes. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and colleague in the consulate, who had been cleverly entertained outside the Curia by Trebonius while the crime was being committed, initially took refuge in his home, fearing he would be the conspirators' next victim. However, he soon realized that the situation offered him a unique opportunity to seize power. He seized Caesar's papers and personal treasure and began negotiating with the various political players. The main conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, had retreated to the capital, seeking a safe place and waiting for the support of the Senate and the people. However, they found themselves increasingly isolated and without a clear plan on how to proceed. They had killed the dictator, but they had not thought about how to restore the Republic or who would assume power. The fate of Caesar's body was, at first, uncertain and pathetic. His body, stabbed 23 times, although according to the doctor Antistius, who examined it later, only one of the wounds, the second one to the chest, had been fatal, was left lying for several hours on the bloody floor of Pompey's Curia, while panic and confusion took hold of the city. Finally, according to Suetonius, 3 of his domestic slaves picked him up with difficulty, placed him on a litter, with one arm hanging pitifully, and carried him to his house in the Forum. It was there that Mark Antony, in a gesture of political audacity, convened a session of the Senate for March 17th, 2 days after the assassination. At that session, Antony, with consummate oratory skill, achieved a difficult compromise. On the one hand, amnesty was granted to Caesar's assassins to avoid immediate civil war, but on the other, all of Caesar's acts and provisions were ratified, and it was decided that he would be given funeral honors befitting his rank and divinity, since he had been declared Divus Julius. Julius Caesar's funeral, held a few days later in the Roman Forum, was an event of enormous political and emotional significance. Mark Antony, who was charged with delivering the funeral oration, the Laudatio Funebris, displayed all his oratorical talent to move the crowd and turn it against the conspirators. He extolled Caesar's virtues, his military victories, his generosity towards the people, and above all, he read publicly Caesar's will, in which Caesar bequeathed his gardens to the people of Rome and a large sum of money to every Roman citizen. This posthumous gesture of generosity, combined with the sight of Caesar's bloodied body, or a wax effigy representing him with all his wounds, according to some sources, and Antony's passionate eloquence, provoked an explosion of popular fury against the assassins. The enraged mob stormed the houses of Brutus, Cassius, and other conspirators, forcing them to flee the city. Caesar's funeral pyre was hastily erected in the Forum, and the crowd, in a frenzy of fervor, threw all kinds of precious objects into the flames as offerings. The imminent chaos that the conspirators had sought to avoid with Caesar's death broke out with even greater force. Caesar's death did not restore the Republic, but opened a new and bloody period of civil wars that would last more than a decade. On one side were the Caesarians, initially led by Mark Antony and Caesar's young and unexpected heir, his grandnephew Gaius Octavius, the future Augustus, who, upon learning of his adoptive father's death, quickly returned to Rome from Apollonia, where he was studying, to claim his inheritance and avenge his murder. On the other side were the Republicans, led by Brutus and Cassius, who managed to recruit armies in the eastern provinces. The fighting was fierce and was fought on various fronts, from Italy to Greece and Asia Minor. Finally, in the double battle of Philippi in Macedonia, 44 BC, the combined forces of Antony and Octavian defeated the Republican armies in a crushing victory. Brutus and Cassius, seeing their cause lost, committed suicide, thus putting an end to hopes for the restoration of the oligarchic republic. However, the victory of the Caesarians did not bring peace, but rather a new division of power and a new rivalry, this time between the victors themselves. Mark Antony, who seized control of the eastern provinces and established his base in Egypt alongside Cleopatra, and Octavian, who consolidated his power in Italy and the western provinces. This rivalry would culminate, as we already know, in the Battle of Actium and the death of Antony and Cleopatra, leaving Octavian as the sole ruler of the Roman world and paving the way for the establishment of the empire. The new questions that arose after Caesar's death did not concern so much the material authorship of the crime, which was public and notorious, but rather the true motivations of the conspirators and the long-term consequences of their act. Did they really act out of Republican idealism or out of envy, personal ambition, or fear of losing their privileges? Was their action an act of legitimate tyrannicide, or a simple political assassination that plunged Rome into even greater chaos? These questions would continue to be debated for centuries, and the figure of Caesar, like that of his assassins, would remain the subject of conflicting interpretations. The violent death of Gaius Julius Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 BC was not simply the murder of a man, however powerful and charismatic he may have been. It was an event of seismic magnitude, a true watershed in the history of Rome, and by extension, in the history of the West. Its consequences, both immediate and long-term, were immense, complex, and profoundly transformative, indelibly marking the course of civilization for centuries. Caesar's legacy, despite the brevity of his absolute rule and the brutality of his end, is one of the richest, most controversial, and most enduring of all antiquity. In the immediate political sphere, as we have already outlined, the most direct and dramatic consequence of his assassination was the definitive disintegration of the Roman Republic and the beginning of a new and even bloodier cycle of civil wars. Far from restoring freedom and senatorial rule, as the conspirators intended or at least proclaimed, Caesar's assassination created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by even more ambitious and autocratic figures, such as Mark Antony, and above all, Caesar's young and unexpected heir, Gaius Octavian. The struggle for Caesar's political and military legacy between these two men, and the subsequent elimination of the last Republican strongholds led by Brutus and Cassius, plunged the Roman world into more than a decade of internal conflicts of unprecedented cruelty and destruction. These civil wars, which were fought from Hispania to Egypt, not only decimated an entire generation of the Roman aristocracy and exhausted the resources of the state, but also demonstrated conclusively the unviability of the old republican system for governing such a vast and complex empire. Finally, it was Octavian who, after defeating Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, 31 BC, managed to establish himself as the sole ruler, and with extraordinary political astuteness and vision, transformed the dying republic into a new regime, the Principate, thus ushering in the long era of the Roman Empire and a period of relative peace and stability known as the Pax Romana. In this sense, it could be argued paradoxically that Caesar's assassination, by eliminating the man who might have established a more personal and less institutionalized monarchy, paved the way for the more lasting, and in many ways, more effective solution that was the Principate of Augustus. The figure of Julius Caesar, despite his official condemnation by the Senate after his death, a condemnation that would soon be revoked, immediately became a powerful myth and a fundamental political reference point for the new imperial regime. Octavian, as his adopted son and heir, based much of his legitimacy on the exaltation of Caesar's memory and achievements, whom he had officially deified as Divus Julius. The name Caesar became synonymous with emperor, and his legacy as a conqueror, reformer, and founder of a new order, albeit incomplete and tragically interrupted, would be claimed by all subsequent emperors. In the military sphere, Caesar's conquests in Gaul not only greatly expanded the borders of Roman rule, incorporating a vast and rich territory that would be crucial to the future of the empire, but also demonstrated the formidable effectiveness of the Roman war machine when led by a strategic and tactical genius of his stature. His innovations in the art of war, his ability to motivate his legions, and his audacity on the battlefield made him a model for generations of Roman generals and military strategists of all ages. Culturally, Caesar also left an indelible mark. His commentaries on the Gallic War and commentaries on the Civil War are not only invaluable first-hand historical sources, but also masterpieces of Latin prose, characterized by their clarity, conciseness, and apparent objectivity, although in reality they are also subtle instruments of personal propaganda. His reform of the calendar, which introduced the so-called Julian calendar, with its 365-day years and a leap day every 4 years, was a scientific contribution of enormous practical significance, which, with some modifications, the Gregorian calendar, remains the basis of our calendar today. His interest in urban planning and public works in Rome laid the foundations for the city's transformation into a true imperial capital under Augustus. And his relationship with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, although politically controversial, also represented a fascinating encounter between two worlds that had a profound impact on the consciousness of Rome and the entire empire. The Senate, although it officially condemned him after his death, a condemnation that would soon be revoked under the pressure of events and the skill of Antony and Octavian, could not prevent Caesar's personality from immediately becoming a powerful legend and a fundamental political reference point for the new imperial regime that was about to rise from the ashes of the Republic. His grandnephew, adopted son, and principal heir, the young and astute Gaius Octavian, based much of his legitimacy and rise to power on the constant exaltation of the memory, deeds, and supposed will of Caesar, whom he had officially deified by the Senate as Divus Julius, the divine Julius, an act of incalculable religious and political significance that set a precedent for the future deification of emperors. The very name Caesar, originally a cognomen of the gens Julia, became from then on an imperial title par excellence, synonymous with emperor, and his legacy as an undefeated conqueror, as a bold reformer and as the founder, albeit unwitting and tragically interrupted, of a new political order, would be claimed, imitated, and often manipulated by all subsequent Roman emperors, from Augustus to the final fall of the empire in the West, and even beyond, in the Byzantine Empire, and in the medieval and modern monarchies that considered themselves heirs to Rome. In the strictly military sphere, Caesar's conquests in Gaul, carried out with a mixture of strategic genius, tactical audacity, and, it must be said, often relentless brutality, not only expanded the borders of Roman rule in an extraordinary manner, incorporating into the empire a vast, rich, and strategic territory that would be crucial to its security and future prosperity, but also demonstrated conclusively the formidable and unsurpassed effectiveness of the Roman war machine when led by a commander of his stature, capable of inspiring fanatical loyalty in his legions and of taking risky decisions at the most critical moments. His innovations in the art of war, his mastery of logistics, his ability to wage siege warfare, his skill in mobile warfare, and his audacity on the battlefield made him an almost unsurpassed model for entire generations of Roman generals and military strategists of all ages and nations. Figures such as Trajan, Napoleon Bonaparte, and even contemporary strategists have studied his campaigns and writings with admiration. Culturally, Gaius Julius Caesar also left a deep and indelible mark on Western civilization. His commentaries on the Gallic War, De Bello Gallico, and his commentaries on the Civil War, De Bello Civili, are not only invaluable first-hand historical sources, offering us a privileged, albeit obviously partial and self-justifying view of his campaigns and the political events of his time. They are also, and this is perhaps even more important from a literary point of view, masterpieces of classical Latin prose, characterized by their crystal clarity, elegant conciseness, apparent objectivity, although in reality, as we have mentioned, they are also subtle and effective instruments of personal propaganda and of constructing his own heroic image, and their direct and vigorous style, which made them models of writing for generations of Latin students and writers. His ambitious reform of the Roman calendar, which based on Egyptian astronomical knowledge, introduced the so-called Julian calendar, with its 365-day years and the addition of a leap day every 4 years to correct the discrepancy with the solar year, was a scientific contribution of enormous practical significance and astonishing durability, since, with the only subsequent modification introduced by Pope Gregory XIV in the 16th century, the Gregorian calendar, which is the one we use today in most of the world, it remains the basis of our system of measuring time. His deep and constant interest in urban planning and the construction of major public works in the city of Rome, although many of his most ambitious projects remained unfinished due to his premature death, laid the foundations and provided the necessary impetus for the profound transformation of the city into a true and dazzling imperial capital under the long and prosperous reign of his successor, Augustus. Projects such as the construction of a new forum, the Forum of Caesar, the expansion of the Circus Maximus, the planning of a large public library, and the diversion of the course of the Tiber to prevent flooding, testify to his vision of the future and his desire to enhance Rome. And his complex and legendary relationship with Cleopatra VII, the last and fascinating queen of Ptolemaic Egypt, although politically highly controversial and used by his enemies to discredit him, also represented, from a broader cultural perspective, a fascinating and fruitful encounter between two of the greatest and oldest civilizations of the ancient world, the Roman and the Egyptian, an encounter that, despite its tragic outcome, left an indelible mark on Western art, literature, and imagination, and opened the doors to greater interconnection and enriching cultural syncretism between East and West in the centuries to come. However, and this is where the figure of Caesar becomes even more complex and his legacy deeply ambiguous, alongside the memory of the undefeated general, the reformist politician, the brilliant writer, and the man of exceptional culture and intelligence, there also survives, with equally powerful force, the image of the ambitious dictator, the populist demagogue, the destroyer of republican freedoms, and the man who, with his insatiable thirst for power and personal glory, opened the door to imperial tyranny and the definitive disappearance of a system of government which, with all its imperfections and crises, had brought Rome to the top of the world for almost 500 years. For his contemporary enemies, and for many defenders of republican ideals throughout history, Caesar was the very archetype of the tyrant, the man who, under the guise of defending the interests of the people and restoring order in a corrupt and decadent republic, did nothing but satisfy his own excessive ambition, accumulating unprecedented power in his hands, despising traditional laws and institutions, and paving the way for the establishment of an autocratic monarchy that, although it brought with it a long period of peace and stability, the Pax Romana, also meant the irreparable loss of civil liberties and political participation for citizens. His perpetual dictatorship, however brilliant, however effective and necessary some might consider it given the circumstances of extreme crisis in which the Republic found itself, set a disastrous and dangerous precedent for the future of the Roman Empire, where the emperor's omnipotent will, often capricious, cruel, or simply incompetent, would too often be placed above the law, tradition, and the most basic rights of individuals. The moral or existential lesson that can perhaps be drawn, with a force that transcends the centuries, from the intense, contradictory, and ultimately tragic life and death of Gaius Julius Caesar is probably, among many others, that of the ultimate vanity and extreme fragility of earthly glory and power, however great, absolute, and seemingly invulnerable they may appear. The man who had conquered the known world, who had subjugated entire peoples to his will, who had believed himself to be a descendant of gods, and who had perhaps come to consider himself a divinity on earth, finally succumbed, in the most brutal and humiliating manner, to the betrayal of his own friends and companions, to the murderous daggers of those whom he had pardoned and showered with honors, in the very heart of Rome, in the very place where he had so often exercised his power and received the applause of the crowd. His empire, which he had forged with so much blood, so much effort, and so much military and political genius, although it did not collapse immediately after his death, was plunged into a new and terrible spiral of civil wars, demonstrating the extreme fragility of the most ambitious human constructions when they depend excessively on the life, charisma, and will of a single individual, however exceptional he may be. His story reminds us, with tragic eloquence that has lost none of its relevance, of the timeless warning of the biblical Ecclesiastes: vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And it invites us, time and again, to reflect deeply on the ephemeral and illusory nature of human greatness, on the insurmountable limits that fate, illness, betrayal, or simple death impose even on the most powerful, the most intelligent, and the most fortunate of mortals. The central question we posed at the beginning of this long and detailed narrative: was the assassination of Julius Caesar an act of patriotic liberation, or the beginning of a new and even more terrible tyranny? Still has no single, simple, and universally accepted answer that satisfies everyone equally. Despite advances in historical research, the accumulation of new evidence, and the application of new methods of analysis, the judgment of Caesar and his assassins remains deeply complex, ambiguous, and ultimately dependent on the ideological and moral perspective of each historian and each era. For some, the conspirators of the Ides of March, led by Brutus and Cassius, were true republican heroes, martyrs of freedom, men who, moved by noble idealism and a deep love for the ancient traditions of Rome, dared to risk their own lives and fortunes to rid their homeland of a tyrant who threatened to destroy it. Their act, though violent and bloody, was a necessary evil, a last-ditch attempt to save the Republic from the absolute monarchy to which Caesar was inexorably leading it. For others, however, Caesar's assassins were nothing more than a group of resentful, envious, and selfish aristocrats who acted not so much out of a selfless love of freedom, but rather out of fear of losing their own ancestral privileges, political influence, and immense fortunes in the new order that Caesar was trying to build, an order that, although perhaps more autocratic, also promised to be more just, more efficient, and more beneficial to the masses and the provinces of the empire. From this perspective, Caesar's assassination would not have been an act of liberation, but a sterile and counterproductive crime, which not only failed to restore the Republic, but also plunged Rome into a new and even more terrible wave of civil wars, proscriptions, and suffering, and which paradoxically accelerated the arrival of the empire in an even more consolidated and lasting form in the figure of Augustus. And between these two extreme interpretations, there is, of course, a wide spectrum of nuances and intermediate positions that recognize the complexity of the motivations of the historical actors, the ambiguity of the situations, and the difficulty of making absolute moral judgments about events so distant and so momentous. And so, Julius Caesar's improvised tomb in the Roman Forum, over which a temple dedicated to his cult as divine Julius would later be erected, was closed more than 2 millennia ago, not only over the mortal remains of a man who, for better or worse, irreversibly changed the course of Western history, but also over a moral and political enigma that continues to fascinate, challenging, and dividing humanity. His legacy, like that of all great figures who have left an indelible mark on the collective memory, is a battlefield where conflicting interpretations clash, where the passions and prejudices of each era are projected, and where the search for historical truth becomes a constant exercise in humility, criticism, and reflection. But beyond historiographical debates and moral judgments, the story of Julius Caesar, and especially that of his tragic and bloody end, continues to resonate with surprising force and relevance in our own day, reminding us eloquently and often painfully of the turbulent passions that move the hearts of men, the excessive ambitions that often blind their reason, the fragility of political institutions in the face of the strength of exceptional individuals, and the unfathomable enigmas that, despite all our efforts, continue to lurk behind the great and small events that mark the tortuous, fascinating, and ever unfinished path of human history. What do you think? Having followed this long, detailed, and I hope also exciting chronicle of the life and death of one of the greatest and most controversial men of all time, do you believe that Julius Caesar was fundamentally a visionary hero who tried to save Rome from itself, or an ambitious tyrant who destroyed the last vestiges of republican freedom? Do you consider his assassins to have been idealistic patriots or mere criminals driven by hatred and envy? Was his death a necessary evil or an irreparable tragedy? I invite you once again to leave your thoughts, personal theories, and deepest feelings in the comments accompanying this account. And if these chronicles, which fearlessly delve into the most shocking, mysterious, and momentous endings of the great figures of royalty and power, captivate you, move you, and make you think, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, support us with your valuable like, and continue to accompany us on this exciting and endless journey through the unfathomable enigmas, enduring lessons, and necessary warnings that the past, that relentless but also infinitely revealing mirror of our own contradictory humanity, continues to offer us day after day, century after century, millennium after millennium, after millennium, after millennium, after millennium, after millennium, after millennium,